Edge Hill is one of the most significant heritage sites in Britain. In 1830, this Liverpool suburb was the western limit of the world's first passenger-carrying railway. From here, tracks led to Liverpool's original passenger station at Crown Street. There was also a cable-hauled incline down to the burgeoning docks at Wapping. Built largely in a tunnel, the incline included a ruling gradient of 1 in 48. As part of the 150th anniversary celebrations of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1980, the remains of Edge Hill's historical monuments were open to the public. The area had once been distinguished by this Moorish arch, connecting the twin towers housing the winding engines. Above the tunnel mouth were 2 Ionic columns, which in reality were furnace flues. Today, this national site is strangely neglected. Only a short length of the former cable-hauled right-of-way survives as an electrified head shunt. During the 19th century, Liverpool rapidly expanded, becoming the second port of the empire. The local rail network also increased dramatically. Eventually, a semicircle of terminal stations, Exchange, Lime Street and Central, was developed, each by a different company. Branches, sidings and goods yards sprang up as the rival companies sought access to the periphery of the dock estate. Within the estate itself, work was mainly handled by a fleet of dock-board saddle tanks. From 1893, these passed beneath the city's famous overhead railway. Edge Hill is now the world's oldest surviving passenger station still in regular use. In 1836, a mile-long extension brought trains to Lime Street by a steeply graded tunnel, which remained cable-hauled until 1870. Eventually it was widened to carry 4 tracks. For over 150 years, Liverpool's premier station has dispatched trains to most corners of the country, handling at its peak some 500 daily arrivals and departures. The 2 curving elliptical roofs were erected in the late 1860s, when the original Georgian-style station was transformed. Spanning 9 platforms, they are 620 feet long. "5819 was a London and North Western Prince of Wales Class 460 dating from 1922. During the 20s, the station had a staff of some 365, responsible for crack expresses, the 45-minute trains to neighbouring Manchester, the many local stopping services, various boat trains, as well as a massive number of letters and parcels. 5608 Wolverine was an earlier Prince of Wales Class 460 dating from 1911. The signal cabin in the station throat controls some 50 signals, but owing to the confined space, all movements within the terminal were supervised by on-the-spot inspectors. Although convenient for the city centre, Lime Street was awkwardly placed for passengers making for the landing stage. Arrangements were revolutionised when the dock board opened its own riverside station in 1895. through London boat trains could now make the trip in just 4 hours. Owing to a weight restriction on a dockboard bridge, for the final section from Edge Hill, trains were entrusted to a pair of Webb coal tanks, nicknamed Lime Street Choppers. Up to 4 times a day, the 2 platforms would swarm with people. Liverpool was indeed the European portal to the New World. With the growth of cheap air travel in the 50s and 60s, the lucrative transatlantic liner trade would rapidly slump into oblivion. The web of wharves, quays and transit sheds along the 7 miles of docks were mostly rail-served. Thousands of 4-wheeled wagons and vans handled every conceivable cargo, including many perishable commodities. Garston Dock was the main centre for the banana traffic, which would survive into the mid-60s. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, the various company yards would discharge huge amounts of tonnage. Transfer work to the quayside was handled by the dockboard's own sturdy tank engines. Liverpool suffered appalling wartime destruction. Many railway installations were damaged or permanently destroyed during the bombing of 1940-41. After the post-war boom, increased containerization coupled with improved mechanization led to closure of many docks and dock-based industries. Unemployment levels increased. Much of the old dock work had been labor-intensive. Note the foreman in his trilby, while the men under his watchful eye sport the obligatory cloth cap. Most men have been employed on a casual basis, fitting in with arrivals of the various vessels. As thousands sought to escape from post-war austerity, many seaside resorts enjoyed a sudden upturn in their fortunes. In 1946, 2 years before nationalisation of the railways, crowds streamed off a Liverpool Electric at Southport, whilst a Jubilee rolled in, possibly on an excursion from the Manchester area. Amazingly, within 15 years, Dr. Beeching was to recommend axing the heavily used electric commuter line to Liverpool. The relentless rise of the private car did eventually lead to many railway closures. However, even in the 40s, some lightly traffic lines were already in serious financial difficulties. Unable to compete with the rival electric service, all passenger trains on the former 14-mile CLC branch from Southport Lord Street, seen here, to Aintree Central were discontinued in January 1952. Principal trains ran to Liverpool and Manchester via Gattaca. Latterly, the branch was at its busiest during the annual Southport Flower Festival. Freight did survive as far as Altcar and Hill House, but the remaining 6 miles to Lord Street, including this stretch through the isolated sand dunes, was abandoned. Here the line ran close to the sea, between Ainsdale Beach and Birkdale. Each year, Aintree, home of the Grand National, witnessed a huge influx of traffic on race days. In 1953, the gleaming Royal train was an added attraction, complete with its superb carriages, including this 12-wheel veteran. Passing alongside the Runcorn Transporter Bridge, a train crossed both the Mersey and the Manchester Ship Canal in the early 1950s. With its unrivaled views of the docks, the overhead railway was a magnet for visitors. It also offered tantalising glimpses of Dockland steam. For example, this 1917 Andrew Barclay Fireless had been at Clarence Dock Power Station since its opening in 1931. At Bramley Moor Dock, the Lancashire and Yorkshire high-level coal branch ran over the overhead, whilst just beyond, a dockboard tank was shunting in the distance. Number 3 was an outside cylinder Avonside dating from 1930. At the south end of the overhead, riders could look down upon Brunswick Goods and the 5-track CLC shed. From within a very cramped space, power was provided for passenger, goods and shunting duties. At James Street, the overhead crossed the underground Mersey Railway at right angles. Whilst lurking beneath the structure itself, it was sometimes possible to watch an 1891 Lancashire and Yorkshire 040 saddle tank. These trusty workhorses trundled along the dockboard metals, bells clanging, whistles screeching, as they shuffled under the docker's umbrella. The last pug would be stored at Speke Junction in February 1963. With the overhead scheduled to close in December, enthusiasts took full advantage of the once-yearly Grand National specials to film the ancient electrics amongst the visiting steam in March 1956. Here, an LOR train sparked past Aintree sorting sidings, which accommodated many of the race day excursions. Ford Station had closed in April 1951 when the Exchange Aintree electric service was discontinued. This Midland 2P was coupled to Jubilee Resolution. Passing Aintree Shed, followed by a glimpse of steamy Aintree Central. A sign of things to come. The prototype Deltic, owned by English Electric, first worked the Up Merseyside Express and the Down Shamrock in late December 1955. Despite increasing dieselisation, Liverpool still had some 300 steam locomotives in 1957, of which well over a third were at Edge Hill Shed. Patriot, or Baby Scott Southport, was regarded as one of the shed's finest express engines. Stanier Royal Scot 46123 departed for the 193-mile trip to Euston with one of Edge Hill's stable of Ginties acting as a banker. A Duchess made for the shed, with top-link driver Bert Aitchison at the controls. Drivers needed a good head of steam for the climb up to Edge Hill, where the ruling gradient was at times as steep as 1 in 83. The mogul would have brought in the empty stock. Two classes long associated with Edge Hill were Stanya's Princess Royal Pacifics and his 460 Royal Scots, the latter dominating workings to Birmingham, Leeds and Carlisle. Several scenes of the squad of Scots based at Edge Hill. Firstly, the appropriately named the King's Regiment, Liverpool. And then 46164, the Artist's Rifleman. The Princesses, or Lizzies, had held pride of place on the Londons since 1939. Bert Aitchison brings Southport home on a Newcastle. The period between 1959 and 1962 marked a profound change in the use of motive power on the former London and North Western main lines radiating out from Liverpool. Work had started on upgrading the track in preparation for eventual electrification to Crewe. For example, the running directions between Lime Street and Edge Hill were altered in September 1960. And the following August, all semaphores would have been displaced by coloured light signalling. Starting in 1959, steam would gradually be ousted from the London expresses, and then in January 1961, from Trans-Pennine duties to Newcastle. By the March of 1961, little scheduled work was left for Edge Hill's express engines. Dating from 1959, when Edge Hill boasted some 40 Lizzies, Baby Scots and Jubilees, these scenes recapture something of the splendour of steam on the 4 tracks between Wavertree and Allerton Junction. The little-used suburban station at Wavertree having closed in August 1958, Sefton Park, seen here, followed in May 1960. Mossley Hill. Note the former London North Western sleeping car in use as a works coach. Princess 46207 rounded Speak curve on the down Red Rose. Inroads were now being made into Liverpool's stud of former London and North Western freight locos. Some of these Super Ds were seen awaiting scrap at Speak Junction. Dating from 1912, the last of these Liverpool-based 080s would finally bow out at the end of 1962, displaced by an influx of Black 5s and 8Fs. A Ginty tackled the shed curve before descending the 1 in 27 incline into the shed area itself. Included in a tour organised by the SLS on the 6th of June 1959 was the 8-mile remnant of the former CLC branch to Southport, closed in early 1952. Starting from Riverside, the tour was in charge of one of Edge Hill's remaining 20 Super Ds, number 49173. Edging through Waterloo goods, prior to tackling the one-time cable-hauled ascent up through Waterloo and Victoria tunnels. Such a heavy train also required assistance. On reaching the summit, the 080 having failed, sister engine 49434 was summoned as a replacement. Another of the class was seen when the tour visited the extensive goods yards at Alexandra Dock, opened in the early 1880s. The tracks connecting the electrified Southport line with the freight-only North Mersey branch were followed in order to reach Aintree. Arriving at Southport Junction, on the north side of Aintree Central. These next scenes typify the remote and unremunerative nature of much of the old branch. Passing the former station at Sefton and Maghull. Lydiate. The surviving 8 miles had been retained to serve private sidings at Altcar and Hill House, which finally closed in May 1960. Nicknamed Wheezers, 49434, destined to be one of Liverpool's last Super Ds, was withdrawn in early November 1962. To complete the rest of the tour, the 080 had to run round at Southport Junction in order to join the L&Y main line. Also on the way out were the last trio of Aspinall 242 tanks, one of which was still assigned to Southport Shed in 1961. This design dated back to 1889. Having disgraced itself whilst on Southport Shed, the York and Lancaster Regiment was rescued by the breakdown train. Stanya's Jubilees enjoyed a long association with Southport. Built in the mid-30s, these 460 express engines were regular performers on many passenger and excursion trains. Sierra Leone would be the last active member of the class on the London Midland region. In the early 60s, many specials and excursions ran to and from the resort. The few remaining passenger trains on the North Liverpool Belt Line, which served the city's eastern suburbs, were withdrawn on the 6th of November 1960. Storming past Brunswick Shed, outbound from Central Station to Aintree via Gattaca. The Aintree Central trains usually comprise 6 non-corridor coaches hauled by a Fairburn or Stanier 264 tank, from either Brunswick or Walton-on-the-Hill sheds. Latterly, there were only a few poorly patronised peak-hour journeys. The prime purpose of the Beltline, opened in 1879, had been to give the CLC access to the docks. Whilst most of the local yards closed during the mid-60s, the one at Knotty Ash and Stanley would survive until 1972. This departure from Knotty Ash was overlooked by Neil Cossons, now director of the Science Museum, then a student at Liverpool University. Passenger traffic suffered mainly from competition with the corporation's trams and buses, which pursued a more direct course into town. West Derby Yard, a base for local domestic coal supplies, would close on the 1st of June 1964. Opened as late as 1927, Club Moor had been built to serve nearby housing developments. The 4 platforms at Aintree Central would be retained to handle Grand National excursion and horsebox traffic until 1963. Aintree Shed, built in 1886 to serve the adjacent sorting sidings, consisted of 8 covered roads, 5 sidings and a turntable. It provided motive power for heavy coal trains, local shunting, trips to the docks and work at Versackley Marshalling Yard. By 1959, the last of the Fowler 080 Austin 7s had been replaced by austerity WDs. However, still on the active roster were a handful of Victorian Aspinall 060s, an L&Y design dating from 1889. The last Aintree example, 52311, would be withdrawn in March 1962. Many of the Derbyshire and Yorkshire coal trains were assigned to the LMS Crabs. With the decline in steam passenger workings, express classes were rostered onto goods turns. Jubilee Vernon, probably a visitor, patiently awaits its next call of duty. Given a mechanical coaling plant in the late 30s and a new roof in the mid-40s, Aintree Shed Code 8L closed its doors in mid-1967. The building was not demolished until 1996. Across the city, Brunswick Shed, with its distinctive curved outer wall, closed in September 1961. Despite introduction of electric workings between Liverpool and Crewe in June 1962, many regular and relief Londons were to remain steam-powered for another 2 years. Next, views of Britannia's, regular visitors to Merseyside during the 60s, and also Stania Pacific 46233, the first of 4 allocated to Edgehill, starting in September 1960. Out of a total of 163 Liverpool-based steam locomotives, the Premier Shed, parts of which were now 100 years old, accounted for 63, Black Fives forming the largest single class. The last Edgehill Duchess survived until the autumn of 1964. However, occasional passenger trains, together with many parcels and freights, continued to pass through Mossley Hill until the spring of 1968. With diminished traffic in the South Docks, some of the dockboard steam fleet could now be scrapped. Looking towards Brunswick Goods, with the original Garston and Liverpool passenger station in the corner. The board had acquired a few new diesels. By an ancient ordinance, the dockboard locos were restricted to 5 miles an hour, and a bell had to be rung continuously. This worked off a rocker linked to the connecting rod. They also had high-pitched whistles, very like French engines. At the north end, the former L&W yards at Alexandra and Canada docks were still relatively busy, all traffic travelling to the Edgehill Gridiron via the Bootle branch. Drifting past the sidings, feeding Lister Drive Power Station. The power station consumed thousands of tons of coal every day. On June the 17th, the local University Public Transport Society organised the Liverpool Suburban, a 60-mile tour encompassing many former company yards and branches. The loco was Edgehill's long-serving Ginty 47487. Passing Stanley Box on the way to Alexandra Dock. Having visited several other freight-only sections, the tour descended to Huskisson Goods. Once dispatching some 20 long-distance freights per day, this former CLC yard survived until late 1978. On leaving Huskisson, 47487 followed the North Liverpool line through Knotty Ash and Stanley. Finally, IT90 visited Garston Docks branch. The 060 would join the scrap ranks in September 1965. Concurrent with the closure of the local Southport Crosslands electric service in September 1964, the entire route to Preston was abandoned, although steam would remain on certain Manchester workings until January 1967. On the final Saturday, 42551 backed down onto a Preston train. The year began with 50 engines of 3 classes at Edge Hill. These included 7 Ginties. The breakdown train always occupied track 19. Broad Green was on the original Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Drifting towards Roby, probably making for Huyton Quarry. The Grand National, held on the 25th of March, produced the usual flurry of excursions, although diesels were increasingly in charge. In the interwar years, up to 60 specials, many double-headed, had descended on Aintree. The race is over, one of the pre-war Black Fives, having been coaled and watered at Aintree, piloted Britannia Firth of Tay past the shed towards the Bootle branch. Despite a drop in North Atlantic trade and ever-increasing modernisation, the remaining dockboard tanks could still be found at various locations north of Prince's Dock. Number 4, shortly to be withdrawn, was an Avonside outside cylinder of 1930. Next, a brief glimpse of the 040 based at Clarence Dock Power Station. Recognising Dockland steam would soon be gone, the Liverpool University Public Transport Society achieved a real scoop when they obtained sanction from the Dock Board to hold the first ever tour of the estate on May the 8th. The assembly point was Prince's Dock. In charge of the string of open wagons was the oldest loco in the fleet, Avonside No. 1 of 1904. Travelling north to Gladstone, the loco ventured into many docks and quays. Brocklebank. Is it possible? Could No. 1 really have had a female fireperson? Or could she just be someone's lucky girlfriend? The board's newest Hudswell No. 42 brings up the rear. Reversing at West Alexandra for the return south. The junction outside Holland and Wolff on Regent Road led into Huskisson, one of the board's 5 loco sheds. Opened in 1850, the former L&Y terminus was still a haven of steam, with a variety of expresses, semi-expresses and stopping trains radiating out to Scotland, Yorkshire and deep into the Lancashire hinterland. BR standards like 75049 had replaced the last of Bank Hall's Aspinall tanks and were used not only on passenger turns but also for shunting and empty stock workings. In its final form, Exchange had 10 platforms, number 1 handling incoming parcels. The turntable prevented deadheading back to Bank Hall. The shed's long-serving Jubilees, Jutland and Impregnable, would be withdrawn by the end of the year. Another Bank Hall stalwart during the mid-60s was this 460, later transferred to Chester. Sandhills, situated just a mile north of Exchange. This offered a rich mix of motive power, especially on summer Saturdays. Activity close to Fazakerley sidings on the Wigan-Manchester line. New tower blocks at Kirby. The junction with the tracks leading into the Kirby industrial estate. Rusting rails reflected the rundown in the docks. For example, this former bustling L&Y interchange sidings at Aintree had once totalled 18 miles of track. From here, smaller engines had then shuttled back and forth to the high-level coal railway and then the yards at Great Howard Street, Bankfield and North Mersey. At Knowsley Road, Bootle, one of Aintree's one-time stud of over 20 clanking WDs, which by the end of 1965 would all have been sent away to the eastern region. With Atlantic liner traffic now in terminal decline, Riverside's days were numbered. On a bleak January the 14th, a leaking 8F hauled an empty stock working over the Prince's Dock swing bridge, preceded by a man with a red flag. After crossing the busy dock road, the loco entered Waterloo Goods. "45156 storms towards Stanley. This was taken during the dying weeks of steam haulage on the through Euston Southport coaches. Usually worked by 264 tanks, the last of these trains operated on Friday the 15th of March. For trains arriving from London, the loco travelled light from Lime Street before coupling up to its 2 detached coaches in the Southport Bay at Edge Hill. It then proceeded on to the Bootle branch. About to be enveloped by the Stygian gloom, approaching Atlantic Dock Junction. Having joined the electrified line at Bootle Junction, the tank accelerated towards Seaforth and Litherland, the one-time interchange point with the overhead railway. In charge was driver Walter Baxter. A few days later, the Bootle branch hosted a few Grand National specials. IZ44 was double-headed by 45431 and 45069. The few surviving steam workings from Liverpool Central towards Manchester Central expired in June, prior to services being rerouted to Lime Street in the September. Some of the fastest expresses between the two cities had covered the 40 miles in 40 minutes. By the end, only a handful of steam turns remained, including a few cross-country duties. BR had wanted to close Central entirely, but was forced to keep part of the increasingly derelict station open for several years for the local Gattaca via Hunts Cross DMUs. On the 5th of May, the first of 5 football specials thundered through Aintree. On the same day, an Eastern Region WD laboured through Old Roan. The third special was hauled by the London Midland Region's last active Jubilee, Bank Hall's 45627, which was withdrawn in the September. The last of the soccer quintet encountered this severe speed restriction. The trains were carrying Liverpool supporters to Hampden Park, Glasgow. The Black 5 was based at Speke Junction. Liverpool has had a long association with biscuit manufacturing. Closeted within the Jacobs factory at Aintree in 1966 was this attractively lined-out petrol locomotive. Retained purely as a standby for the company's regular battery electric, it had been built by Baguley Cars Limited in 1916. It was used solely for internal shunting. Note the simple cab roof and the prominent lamps at either end. Now preserved, the loco last operated in 1967. Southport Shed, code 8M, closed on June the 6th, although steam would continue on local stopping trains until September and on the Manchester Club trains until January 1967. As part of the RCTS South Lancashire Rail Tour, held on the 24th of September, the participants travel from St Helens behind named Black 5 45154 en route to Garston Docks, where they pass three imposing former LNW boxes. First, Speke Junction, then Garston Junction, controlling the west side of Speke Triangle and the entrance to the nearby shed. Finally, Church Road on the Garston Docks line and the connecting branch onto the CLC main line at Cressington. Here, the loco ran round its train before heading towards the North Liverpool line. This would be Lanarkshire Yeomanry's swan song, as the 30-year-old loco was withdrawn from Speke Junction shortly afterwards. The nameplate was, in fact, a wooden replica. At Southport Junction, the rusting rails of the former CLC branch stretched into the distance. Further manoeuvres allowed the tour to proceed via the Bootle branch down to Riverside. This unique signal at Prince's Dock controlled both train and shipping movements. A month later, Riverside was the starting point for the Wirral and Mersey Special, organised by the Liverpool University Public Transport Society. Departing at 9 in the morning, Fairborne 264 Tank 42235 hauled the special on the first leg of its journey. Note the man with the red flag preceding the train at walking pace across the swing bridge. Having attached pilot 45015, the pair nosed through Waterloo Goods before plunging into the choking tunnels up to Edge Hill. At the summit of the 1950's incline, the Black 5 was detached. The tank then turned at Edge Lane Junction onto the Bootle branch in order to gain access to the L&Y main line to Wigan. Further coverage of this fascinating four-loco tour appears in our companion video, Steam on the Wirral. 17th of October 1966 marked the closure of Bank Hall, shed code 8K. Although primarily a passenger shed, it had also housed a small number of Dockland tank engines. Bound for exchange, a train passed Sandhill's number 2 box and the entrance to the shed. These extensive sidings surrounding Sandhills Junction survived in much reduced form until November 1974. As diesel usage increased, the last of the versatile Ginties was withdrawn from Edge Hill in December 1966. Edge Hill's allocation was now just 43 Black 5s and 8Fs. Mainly employed on local trip work, they also made occasional appearances on passenger and parcels turns. Part of the old shed had been demolished to allow for construction of a diesel servicing facility. This 460 had been allocated to the shed since 1960. Speke Junction had now overtaken Edge Hill with some 50 engines, including a number of 9Fs. A class briefly associated with the shed in the mid-60s had been these Ivered Moguls. In February 1967, visiting 46520 was in charge of this enthusiast special. The highlight included a visit to Liverpool Central. Here the train emerged from the CLC's longest tunnel at Great George Street. Opened in 1874, Central had 3 island platforms. Carved out of sandstone, the increasingly decrepit station did not finally close until April 1972. Retracing the path of the former service to Southport Lord Street, the special travelled along the North Liverpool line as far as Aintree Central. Having run round its train in the gathering twilight, the Mogul headed for Aintree Shed, which would finally close on the 12th of June, 1967. As if defying all the odds, the Grand National still produced a couple of double-headed steam turns. Four 8119 worked light engine and brake back towards Edge Hill. By now, most movements on the Bootle branch were to and from Canada Goods Yard, which from 1870 to 1941 had been terminus for a passenger service from Lime Street. The yard finally closing in September 1982. Passenger trains had also terminated at Alexandra Dock until 1948. This yard had closed in the January of 1967. Preparing to storm the sulphurous tunnels and deep rock cuttings on the long climb up from the waterfront. belching out of Spellow Tunnel. Smoke-filled action in the vicinity of the former Walton and Anfield station. At the south end of the branch near Pighew Lane Junction. On returning to base, crews entered the coal hole with its ash disposal unit and mechanical coaling stage installed in 1915. 3 40-ton bunkers were fed by wagons hoisted up a steep gradient by rope and capstan. Dominating the whole vista was the world-famous gridiron, a massive 70 acres of sidings developed by the London and North Western starting in 1873. Stretching for over a mile, the gravity-worked gridiron could handle 1,000 wagons a day on its 60 miles of track. Skill and sharp reflexes were the order of the day. On arrival in the reception sidings, the brakes were secured on each wagon and a number chalked on its side. Having been uncoupled by a yardman, he then yelled out the chalk number to another man who relayed this information to a shunter in charge of the points. Brake poles control speed where gradients could be as steep as 1 in 50 on some curves. At its height, the gridiron had employed over 80 men, handling some 2,200 wagons every 24 hours. Close by, but looking distinctly out of place among its bigger brethren, was another biscuit loco. Owned and operated by Crawfords, this 1917 Andrew Barclay Fowlus assembled vans within the Binns Road complex. When rail traffic to the factory ceased 3 years later, Dolly May, originally built for the First World War Ministry of Munitions, fortunately escaped into preservation. In 1967, only 4 dockboard steamers remained, the second oldest being number 21, an outside cylinder Hunslet dating from 1913. This had the typical flangeless centre wheels to cope with the many sharp curves. The battered spark arresters tended to look increasingly skew-whiff. Steam was now very much on borrowed time. Number 31 represented a pair of inside cylinder Hunslets delivered during the war in 1941. Motioned forward by one man and guarded by another with a red flag, the 060 entered the dock estate. This Hunslet inside cylinder 11, dating from 1940, puffed sedately out of Huskisson onto the main line. Interestingly, 11 did not have the prefix number painted on the cab side. Crossing the dock road into one of the former company yards.